Welcome to lesson 86, talking about number families. Number families is understanding the relationship between different kinds of numbers. And so we can take a look at the list of numbers that we have on the screen at the moment. We have a couple different ideas that we want to talk about. First of all, we have counting numbers. You've been using counting numbers since you've been counting. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that list, of course, continues on forever. And so we have that really singular idea of counting numbers. Now, counting numbers expands into a different group known as whole numbers when we add the number 0, just like we're seeing here. Now we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to infinity as we are dealing with this idea. So far as we've looked at numbers, we have really simple numbers. From here we can move on to what are known as integers, and integers brings on the opposite side of that number line, looking at negative numbers. And so we have the addition of an infinity's worth of negative numbers that seems to come together with everything else. And finally we get what are known as rational numbers. And rational numbers is another area you've been working with for a rather long time. Mostly, so far in the early stages, you work more on the positive side of rational numbers, dealing with your decimals, dealing with your fractions. But rational numbers, of course, also fit the negative side of it and have negative decimals and negative fractions as you're working with this. In the end, we come away with these four main groups: counting numbers, whole numbers, integers, and rational numbers. And eventually, as you learn higher levels of math, you'll get into irrational numbers and different things like that. But we're not going to worry about that right now. In fact, we don't need to worry about it at all. When we get to it, we get to it. This lesson is all about understanding these number families and the relationships that exist within these number families. So let's take a look at this. From this understanding of our numbers, we can kind of come away with this diagram. Counting numbers, of course, is the smallest group because it starts with that number 1 and then, of course, continues on. Whole numbers gets just a little bit larger because it includes 0, but then, of course, it has to then include whole numbers. Integers gets much, much larger as we can now go positive and negative within our scheme of numbers. And then rational numbers gets immensely larger because now you have every decimal place value that exists and every fractional value that goes along with this. And so we can see how counting numbers are included in whole numbers, and whole numbers are included in integers, and integers are included in rational numbers. And so we have these boxes overlapping each other to show this relationship. Then, from here, we want to be able to use that information to be able to correctly graph different kinds of lines so that the statement that's being made is true. Now, we're dealing with integers. If we look back at our graph right here, integers, of course, are all positive and negative numbers, but they don't include rational numbers. That means there's no fractions, there's no decimal parts to these numbers. So in that case, if we were to graph this, it says less than, actually it says less that, I probably should say less than 4. All right. So in this case, we're looking at this idea. We're not actually including the number 4. And so we talked about the idea of putting a circle there to signify that's our starting point, but it's not really included. Now, if we're going to do all the integers, we're going to deal whole numbers that are positive. We're going to include 0, and we're also going to do negative numbers like this. Now, someone might argue, well, why don't I just draw a line like this to represent all the points that I'm putting these dots on? And of course, it has to do with our definition of integers. The fact is you can't put all those in there because all of this space in here is rational number space. those decimals, those fractional parts, those are rational numbers. They are not integers. So because the problem specifically asks for integers, I have to just single out these positive and negative values without getting into smaller bits and pieces. All right, let that sink in for just a minute. Hopefully it all made sense. If not, jot yourself down a question. So as we look at this, we want to be able to answer some true and false questions. So here are some questions for you to look at as you are studying the relationship between these number families. As you finish up these questions then, be able to justify your answers or prove your answers or explain why. And in the end, we can say, hey, you better understand your number families. That's it for lesson 86.